what do you think are the most urgent and perhaps immediate challenges facing food security, and where do you see them geographically?
Well, at UNICEF, obviously, we're focused on children. Children need decent nutrition.
I think bring it closer to her. Thank you.
Is that better? Wait, hold on. There we go.
Yeah.
Better. Okay, great. So I am at UNICEF. We do focus on children. Of course, we're the UN Children's Agency. So for us, making sure that children have proper nutrition and access to food is really critical. One of the biggest challenges we face is famine, which last year was the first time. We had 2 famines at one time in history, so it was a real challenge for the international community to respond to that. From our perspective, there are many things that contribute to this, and the food experts will know some of this better, but what we see from the UNICEF perspective is one of the biggest problems is conflict. Because what happens in conflict is, of course, you have the immediate fighting where children are very vulnerable, but it also undermines all the systems that children rely on, health, education, and of course, food is directly impacted by that. So conflict is a huge challenge for us. The key to it is to avoid it in the first place, if possible, rather than trying to deal with famine in the context of conflict. The other place we're seeing real issues is on climate, because when you have climate disruptions, populations start to move. If all the food disappears, you see this in the Sahel, people start moving, and that obviously that comes into Barham's world, but it is a real challenge because then you are again in a situation where everything is disrupted, the food systems are disrupted, and people don't have access to food.
Interesting. Barham, I want to talk to you about conflicts. And here I saw the news that you were in the Zaatari refugee camp very recently. Can you talk to us about 2 things? How conflicts really impact food security in terms of the shocks to the global system, like we saw with the war in Ukraine, or to the people themselves. And of course, the second would be climate change. But first, I would like to hear about your experience at the Zaatari refugee camp and how it was. And it's good to see someone like you on the ground there.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being invited on this panel. You go to Zaatari and you see so many people, young and old, who have been displaced from their homes and have been in that place for over 12, 13, 14 years. You cannot but really ask a fundamental question. What cruelty, what insensitivity, what inhumanity can drive people to cause so much suffering to people? Of course, Zaatari is a microcosm of what has happened. The Syrian conflict erupting 15 years ago led to the displacement of millions and millions of people. At the time, perhaps from my perspective, being from the region, this conflict could have been contained, prevented, and probably the huge security and insecurity and displacement that was caused could have been averted. But nevertheless, we are where we are today. When you see these refugees at Zaatari or in Kakuma in Kenya, which I visited at the end of my first week in office, or the camps for refugees fleeing the carnage in Sudan, conflict is unfortunately a feature of today's world. Far too many conflicts in what we are talking about, and it is seriously causing untold suffering. Today, the world we live in, we have unprecedented levels of displacement. Nearly 117 million people are displaced worldwide.
117?
117. And of those, nearly 70% of them are in low to middle income countries, are displaced by conflict, by climate shocks, by fragile states, and a number of other factors. But really, when you see people who have been displaced in these undeniably senseless conflicts around the world, it also calls upon us the international responsibility to address these issues at the root causes. These are not mere afterthoughts. Every individual you talk to in Zaatari, in Abisha, in Adre, in Kakuma, in Cox's Bazar with the Rohingyas, for example. They are people with agency. They are people with aspirations and hopes. They are, yes, victims, but they are human beings that they deserve attention. Coming back to the topics of what we're talking about in terms of famine and food insecurity, from a global survey that was done, I think, last year, nearly 3 out of 4 refugees live in places facing food insecurity. 1 in 10 children, refugee children, face acute malnutrition. And of the refugee population that we're talking about, 2/3 of them are stuck in situations of protracted displacement, 5 years and on. Sometimes a decade, sometimes 2 decades. And they remain dependent on international assistance, humanitarian assistance. This is, to me, an entirely unacceptable situation. It points to a structural flaw in the system that we do. I can relate to you one experience that I saw in Chad when I visited. This is the sprawling community of refugees that essentially is mingling with the host community and the villages nearby. I think it was UNICEF, if I were right, were actually helping with UNHCR digging wells, boreholes, 4 boreholes, creating a large area to become a farming area in which host families and refugee families coming together, really ingenious, cultivating tomatoes, vegetables, selling some to the market, and of course, consuming some for their own families. This is the kind of solutions that we should be looking at. Again, of that situation where we have 2/3 of the refugees in the world today are in a situation of protracted displacement, waiting for humanitarian assistance, and pointing to the fact that this system is unsustainable. And others for that matter, with UNICEF, with other UN agencies, with the international actors around the line, we really need to look at inclusive solutions by which you could give people agency, empowering them, helping host nations for inclusive policies that can allow these refugees to live a fulfilling life and to be contributors to the local economies and so on. The task ahead of us is huge, but beyond the humanity and the human responsibility, our shared humanity that compels us to do something about it, the right thing to do is really focus on enabling these communities to live a productive life, addressing some of the fundamental issues. This is not to lose sight of what is needed. While my mandate as UNHCR is refugees and humanitarian assistance and so on, but all of us, Kathy and I and others, we really should maintain the focus on development, the focus on peace as real solutions, because this situation cannot continue, and this is not consistent with what people deserve, dignity and ability to contribute.
Thank you for that. Alvaro, I'll turn to you and Afad. And food logistics is one of the main themes around food security. So given you as a lender, as an investor, what financing models do you think work best for scaling food logistics in low and middle income countries? Is it blended finances? Is it guarantees, or is it concessional capital? What is the best or maybe optimal way of financing food logistics?
So thank you for having us. I think obviously the humanitarian situation and a lot of the, as we have listened from our colleagues, a lot of the conflict is driving hunger, and hunger is driving conflict. In the case of when we're looking at food systems beyond only the logistics, which is how food is being produced, how food is being consumed, how food is being stored, how food is being distributed, how food is being exported. What we have seen is that a lot of countries, after the shocks and some of the wars that we're seeing, are seeing that they are very vulnerable. So a lot of this, they've started to see that they need to actually become food self-sufficient in a number of value chains or in a number of crops. And this is where it all starts. When you're talking about logistics, let me share an example. During the crisis of 2008, actually, there was a huge amount of investment in providing seeds for free. So there was a huge increase on production. The next year, they could not distribute it, they could not store it, so a lot of it went wasted. So I think this is one of the fundamental things that I want to say is that everything is connected. So what we need is actually the ministers of finance, of infrastructure, of energy, of agriculture coming together. So when we are, most of the institutions like ourselves, we are an IFI, we are a development financial institution. When we come together, we do our projects, we do well, we do some impact, but that's not enough. What we have to think is actually how is that transforming certain policies in the country, or how is that then taken over by the private sector. In the case of IFAD right now, to do so, I think just calling for the private sector is never going to happen. You actually need to have the facilities, as you were saying, the instruments, the specific, I would say, needs of the private sector also being met. And usually, and when I go to Davos to talk to the big agribusinesses, they relate to risk and return, but they relate also to reliability, they relate to speed, and how all of that comes together. When you say logistics, you can have a lot of agro-processing industrial zones, you can have the right warehouses, but if there's no roads to connect it, then actually you cannot sell it. You cannot have access to markets. For us, the most fundamental thing is going from the subsistence farming that many times in many countries happens to actually farming as a business. That means to focus on the local private sector and what's the enabling condition. If we are investing, for example, let's say in Niger, in a solar cold storage facility or plant, we also need to make sure that we're working with the minister in terms of energy, of actually changing all of the solar agro-processing regulations, and also then thinking what microfinance or financing institution can also finance that type of equipment. If not, we're just doing tiny investment here, tiny investment that, but we are not transforming. For us, the transformation comes from coming with all of the sectors together across the ministries. And here we have an investor which will probably tell you what are some of the instruments specifically. For us, what is very clear is that there's not a single one. We have, for example, public-private partnerships where we are providing 0% grants to small-scale farmers so that they can invest in climate adaptation.
0% interest grants.
Interest rates, in order to also promote regenerative agriculture, because they need for a number of years to be able not to get a certain return until the fourth or fifth year. So this is also a financial issue. So clearly they need to have that type of financing. And then I think, and this, when we come to this type of fora or Davos, it's also very important to understand that the majority of small-scale or farmers in Africa are small-scale farmers, and that's 80%, and they produce most of the food. And it's not the same to invest in bigger agribusinesses than investing in this type of smaller enterprises. I can tell you there's enough money, and every time I go to Davos, there's lots of sovereign wealth funds who are already picking up all the investment opportunities in Africa, on land, on agribusinesses, but they are the medium to big ones. What we need to make sure is that also the smaller ones have the conditions to thrive, because that's where the livelihoods, that's where the income, that's where I would say the impact happens. That's what, from the IFAD side, we're trying to bring all of these actors together.
Thank you. Cédric, now with the private sector, from your viewpoint and the viewpoint of institutional capital, right? How do you assess risk, scale, and maybe resilience when it comes to scaling food logistics?
Yeah, I think the important thing is to not think about the single asset. It is a system. A lot of people focus on improving the farm yields. Every farm yield improvements without the supply chain, so the cold chain treatment, the storage, is a leakage of value. And so the more you look at it as a system, the more you could de-risk. Margins go throughout the system, they don't disappear. I think that's the first thing. The thing about, I think, where the government can be helpful is on working capital. It's not on capex, it's not on seed. When you have working capital, if you think about agriculture, you put a lot of money into the land, you let it grow, and you only get the revenue at the end. It's a very long cash conversion cycle. So if you speak to most producers, large and small, so it's not just the small ones that have this issue, access to working capital is a big requirement. And institutional capital is actually not that big in this sector. I'll use the US as a data point, just because it has a lot of statistics. The farmland real estate asset class alone, without taking into account the operating businesses, is a $3 trillion asset class. It has less than 2% institutional penetration. This is the first sector of civilization, and no one invests in it. And I think because of it, there's a lot of understanding of the operations. There's a lot of beyond just financial understanding, but I think we need to be pushing more and more institutional capital to come in here. I don't think subsidies is the solution. I think what we could do for small producers is storage. It's those type of supply chain. You know, we produce enough food for everyone on the planet. It is not a question of agricultural yields anymore. It's what happens post-harvest. We lose, depending on what statistics, you lose between 30 to 50% of the production right after. And then we also always talk about calories. I heard nutrition before. Nutrition is what matters. In the fresh produce, from fruits, from proteins, some of them lose in 24 hours of nutritional value if they're not maintained. And it's not just the cold storage, it's what you do post-harvest. If you were able to cool that fruit right away, and those facilities can be public facilities, they can be provided to the small producers. And then what happens is if they have that, they don't need to all sell the produce at the same time. So it even has economic benefits. If you're able to store, you could sell later on, and you could then start playing the export strategy and not all sell and flood the market. It's simple supply-demand dynamics. So I do think there is a lot of engagement that needs to happen with the public sector. And if you look at it from a system perspective, you de-risk. Agriculture is actually a very profitable, you know, some of the business we finance have 45% EBITDA margin.
Wow.
People are focusing on data centers. They don't have these margins. But you need to look at it from a system approach. It's not the asset level. It's not isolating. It is truly a value chain, from both the farming to let's say not the end consumer, but to the retailers. We don't go post to retailers, and it's very profitable. You can make a lot of money and make a lot of good impact. So also feel good about it.
That's interesting, and interesting on the margin you just mentioned there. And like you were saying, everyone's piling money into data centers, which is also important because that's the age we live in. But yet again, we don't see that kind of investment going into other, maybe even more crucial aspects, and that is food security. Catherine, I'd like to touch on the Nutrition Endowment Fund and the one led here by the UAE. How was your experience in that? And what would you like, if there were like kind of learning lessons, what would you like to see going forward?
Well, I think I would say two things. One, really what UNICEF does, because we are both a humanitarian organization and a development organization. So the humanitarian piece is what Barham was describing so perfectly, which is picking up the pieces, really, of when the system fails, when people are starving, when children are starving, when children are on the move, or others on the move. The development piece is really what you're hearing from here, and that's where UNICEF is trying to make sure that there are systems in place to make sure that children are well nourished. We have set up something called the Child Nutrition Fund, which is a fantastic effort where governments have to put some resources in, and it's matched by donors, and it's really trying to make sure that children are nourished properly from the beginning, because if that happens, they have a whole world of opportunities that they don't have if they're malnourished from the beginning. If children are stunted early, they never catch up. They will have problems with their physical development and their mental development the rest of their lives. So making these investments are absolutely critical in the early days when children still are developing, and when you can get nutrition systems in place that can provide for the children, their families, and their communities, and then hopefully avoid conflict, avoid children on the move. It's not going to take care of all conflicts or all natural disasters, but it will make a huge difference if you can get it right from the beginning.
Interesting. Avoiding conflict is such a key here. And Barham, from your experience on the ground and your personal experience, how do you see your role in lobbying? I mean, you're with the UN. Here in the region especially, we have so many refugees, so many conflict zones that even we see coming up in the future. What is your role here? How do you see it in lobbying to avoid conflict?
Look, I mean, you just mentioned I was a refugee myself. I became a refugee in 1974 at age 13, 14. I fled with my family when the war in the Kurdistan has happened, and we left together with thousands of other families. I spent a year at a refugee school, and that was quite an experience. I remember what was done for us at the time in terms of protection and in terms of opportunity to develop meant a great deal. And of course, the history of my community, my people, is defined by displacement, both being displaced and as well as hosting refugees. So this is also really beyond, I'm sure this is a accepted by most people. Refugees are not just numbers. They are people with agency, with protection and opportunity. Instead of being a burden, they are a contribution. Let me come back to this issue of private sector and others about what we can do. Of course, conflict prevention is a requirement of the international system, Security Council, the international actors, the regional actors, to prevent that from happening. But also in terms of dealing with sustainable responses to these matters. I'm very much an advocate of focusing on development and empowerment as tools of inclusion, dealing with the humanitarian consequences of these matters. At the moment, we have more ability with the World Bank, with the financing window for refugee inclusion, with the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. They are having innovative projects to dealing with these issues, certainly on displacement and others. But this is not enough, in my view. How to create that synergy combination with the private sector, the ingenuity of the private sector, because at the end of the day, you do not want to have development as another euphemism for humanitarian assistance. For these developments to be sustainable, it has to be economically viable. And the private sector, as you just mentioned about the margins on agriculture, is really huge. Mm-hmm. When you look at any of these refugee communities, they're quite vibrant in terms of commerce, in terms of little markets popping up here and there. And the question for all of us across the field of the humanitarian assistance, development banks, and the private sector about how we can turn this into scale. Because with this, I think there could be far more opportunities for sustainable responses that can move us out from the situation where we are constantly depending on humanitarian handouts at a time when all the donors around the world are limiting their assistance and so on. So this is what I'm
And conflict is
on.
usually in resource-rich countries and resource-rich zones. So, Alvaro, I want to ask you a question, and coming back to what you mentioned about the public sector. So, as an investor, you put in money in a pilot project. Is that where it stops? Is that a trend that you see? It stops here. How can you get the public sector? How can you get governments to really work on maybe expanding that pilot project or copying it in different areas? Is it regulation? Is it understanding the urgency of that project or the need that you're addressing with the project?
Thank you. I'll be brief. Usually we work also through governments and also with the private sector, and they also implement and we support them in that. I think the three challenges that I see being a financial institution focused on that first mile where food systems and food is being produced. First is, and it was mentioned perhaps, is aggregation of all of these small-scale farmers to really make it a viable investment. The second one probably is also scalability. And this is where obviously we need to have the vehicles, the platforms, the instruments to really make sure that we don't talk about it, but actually are able to mobilize it, the private sector. And I would say the third one is, and this happens a lot in governments, is even the government, usually the ministries of agriculture and the ministries of finance only talk when there's a food crisis. So the same goes with respect to energy, to infrastructure. Unless we have, for example, if you want to build a special agro-processing zone or a certain warehouse zone, you really need to have all of the rest of the logistics and the energy and the infrastructure coming on board. If not, it's just going to be a spillover. So I think that's the main challenge, how to coordinate that. From our side, there's ways, obviously, of incentivizing, of trying to matching things that can really be replicated and that can incentivize governments and regions to do so. Let me share a brief example. For example, in Nigeria, we work with the African Development Bank. It started as a very small project of 40 million with Olam, with the private sector company in food. It then went into a bigger project of 500 million on special agro-processing zones in 4 regions, and now the government wants to expand it to all regions because it has been very successful. So actually, I think that's what I believe that institutions like ourselves should be doing, putting the models that then can be scaled up And at the end, it's a mixture of that private sector and public sector, because at the end, in agriculture, in food systems, most of the investments are coming from the private sector, from the local private sector. So all of these SMEs, small-scale farmers, are private sector.
Yep.
The public sector is a small part that needs to really be able to make sure that they are catalyzing and setting up the right regulations and incentives.
Exactly. I am mindful that we are out of time, but I know, Cédric, that you were in Riyadh last week and now you're in Dubai in the UAE. Is there something that Cordiant Capital is working on?
Yeah, so going back to system investing, we've been investing in agriculture for some time, both on private equity and private credit. We've been working on this specific strategy of effectively creating the largest fresh fruit business from an acreage, northern, southern hemisphere, taking into account not just our own productive assets, but also smallholders. But again, that is just the pre-harvest. Post-harvest is as critical. So specifically for the GCC, we are fundraising now, but we will be deploying to create an end-to-end cold chain infrastructure, not just the storage, but even the rerouting.
The cold infrastructure, you said.
The cold chain infrastructure, so rerouting the trade routes. A lot of the trade routes are established for non-perishable products. If you could save 25 days of transit as opposed to air freight, that adds 25 days of shelf life. So there's all these little savings you do throughout the whole cold chain, really created what we call fresh food security, which is not a 1 year storage, but if you could store, let's say, a table grape that has a lot of nutritional value for 75 days as opposed to 5 days, which is the reality, you've effectively removed yourself from immediate weekly shocks, which is what geopolitical typically does to the fresh food supply chain.
Yeah. And cold logistics, that's getting your lettuce still nice, cold and ripe after, 13, 14 days, I think, the shelf life of lettuce, to your supermarkets. That's it for us. This is a wrap-up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to my panelists.
Thank you.